I didn't intend to make parts 3 and inevitably 4 to this video series, but here we are. After talking about all the possible options out there, I wanted to take some time to focus on some of my personal thoughts on the Gripen and eventually the Hornets, and why I chose them as more realistic competitors to the F-16. If you've heard of the Gripen, you definitely have heard that it's got the ability to operate off of roadways. This is kind of the main thing people bring up whenever saying, hey, the Gripen's probably the better option of, actual performance versus the F-16. And while this is true, there's a lot more to the Gripen and why it is the way it is. I also want to focus in on the idea of European leadership in NATO. While there has been a lot of support from major European countries, they really haven't led the way in supply of arms to Ukraine, aside from the UK and Poland, who have been doing quite a bit of work in Europe. In light of the limited and local patches of air superiority the Ukrainian Air Force has been able to achieve in Kherson and possibly the Kharkiv regions, I thought it'd be a good time to examine why the Gripen might be the best option on paper, and why those successes might actually hurt the chances of getting the Gripen. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to go ahead and do a brief, slightly more detailed overview of the JAS-39C Gripen, not the E, the C, just because there's not a lot of E's flying around at the moment. Kind of going over the pros and the cons of the platform, the arsenal it can use, because it can use quite a bit, the Gripens of the different tactical aviation brigades, so what equipment would they utilize, and kind of generally the ranges and abilities, the logistics of it all, the politics of it all, the special thanks, and some previews for my future videos. So if you want to know where I got some of the artwork, like the one you see here, or you want to know what I'm working on, be sure to stick around to the end of the video. So, this is kind of generally the same thing we had seen last time, for the most part, a couple of additions. We see it's fairly lightweight, we see it's very fast at Mach 2, it's got a fairly decent range, about 500 miles without external fuel tanks, I believe, so that can be extended. It's very fuel efficient, has a service ceiling of about 50,000 feet, so it can get pretty high and do some interception missions. A service life of about 8,000 hours, and some Cs are kind of starting to creep up on that, but have been extended into the 2030s. And then the cost per flight hour for just the base aircraft itself is about $8,000. Now, that doesn't include fuel, manpower, any kind of the extra stuff that is going to be different in your region. So keep in mind, while this is off a base level cheaper than most aircraft, it doesn't necessarily mean it's cheap to fly. We see its thrust-weight ratio and wing loading, meaning it can generate quite a bit of thrust. It has a good amount of ability to carry munitions on it, and it's a very agile, nimble fighter, as it's almost producing as much thrust as the actual base plane weighs. Now, in addition to that, I want to talk about some of the avionics. The PS-05A pulse Doppler radar has an effective range of about 75 miles. Now, this is the radar that's in the C. The E has an AESA radar, so kind of keep that in mind. I've seen some speculation that some Cs may be upgraded to that, but I haven't seen a concrete instance where a C has that. So maybe it's a possibility, but there's just not a lot of E's flying around at the moment. A small handful in Sweden and Brazil. They also use the Cobra helmet-mounted display. It's got a combat or a radar cross-section of anywhere from half a meter to 1.2 meters squared. I believe that is the 0.5. It's probably closer to the E variant, whereas the C is a little bit closer to the 1.2 meters. And that's without any of the armaments or pylons, from my understanding. So it's going to have a bigger radar cross-section than that in combat, but it's still off a base level much smaller than the MiG-29, the Su-27, the Su-25, the Su-24. And we see the Volvo RM12 afterburning turbofan engine, which is a derivative of the General Electric 404J engine. So this is a pretty powerful engine and a fairly light aircraft, making it pretty fast, pretty nimble, and it's got a pretty solid pulse Doppler radar off the bat. The C is, by all means, very functional, very capable, while it's not the E, it is still much better than what the Ukrainians are using at the moment. And that's something we have to keep in mind, that even though the E is the top of the line, I highly doubt Sweden would put Ukraine in front of its orders or Brazil's orders in order to get them the most advanced things on the market. So what are some of the pros of the Gripen? Well, there's a lot going for the Gripen, but unfortunately it's lost out to the F-35 and a pretty large number of procurement competitions. But it's uniquely suited for the Ukrainian use case. It all starts with the BAS-90 or BAS-90 concept developed by the Swedish military in the 70s and 80s. This is the reason we see all those photos of Drakens and Viggens and Gripens rolling out of hangars on the side of a highway and taking off. Having these dispersed Air Force bases, the Swedish are able to effectively combat the possibility of a preemptive strike on their air bases. A preemptive strike like the Russians did at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, and this also to an extent helps them multiply their air power, spreading it out over a larger range, and having these be pretty capable multi-role fighters in their own right. Now, having a capable multi-role fighter hidden in a reasonably safe place that the enemy may not target with a cruise missile to destroy one plane is going to increase the longevity of your jets and your Air Force. This design philosophy is exactly what the Gripen was built to work under, and it makes the Gripen a pretty nasty surprise for any invading forces. This doctrine has not only worked for the Israelis in the Six-Day War, but has also been working for the Ukrainians as they've been forced to adopt it in order to keep their Air Force safe. A large number of the Ukrainian air losses so far have actually come from being destroyed on the ground by cruise missile strikes. Dispersing their aircraft to operate off of smaller, rougher airstrips or roadways has kept the Ukrainian Air Force in the air, avoiding those cruise missile strikes and also getting them closer to the front lines. Maybe not by a whole lot in some cases, but with as low as a lot of those Ukrainian planes are flying, the shorter the route, the better. Luckily for them, central Ukraine is mostly flat open plains with a lot of long straight roadways, so this works out in their favor. Due to this dispersed nature of their air force, the Swedes also required a fairly easily maintained aircraft, something that could be maintained, refueled, and rearmed by conscripts if necessary. Meaning the Gripen would likely be a lot easier to train maintenance crews on and easier to keep them running as opposed to, say, something more complex like an F-16. Having a conscript crew of between 5 and 7 people on a roadway somewhere is a lot better than having a crew of 10 plus on a well-maintained air base, keeping F-16s going as they're getting struck by cruise missiles. At least for the moment. Not only is the Gripen easier to maintain, refuel, and rearm, as it only takes about 10 minutes in terms of its turnaround time with an experienced crew, but it's also got a huge arsenal. Not only is it able to use the best of NATO or what the US has to offer, it can also use IAI or the Israeli Aerospace Industries Python and Derby series of missiles. These are very capable in their own right, with the Python being short range and the Derby being long range. Now, the Gripen C doesn't technically have the IR sensor on the front like the Gripen E does. However, it is still capable of using things like the Python 4 and 5, from my understanding, AIM-9X, the Darter, and the other one that we'll talk about in a second, because I cannot remember the name off of the top of my head, unfortunately. But what about the cons? Because as cool as the Gripen is on paper, there are some problems with it. One of them being the Gripen doesn't exist in large numbers even in the C or D variant. The Swedes only have about 94 Cs or Ds, and that's pretty unideal if you're trying to, send jets anywhere. Now, they still are actively being produced, but the Swedes currently have an order out for more Es as well as the Brazilians. So it's not necessarily something that the Swedes would be able to do in short order. There's a lot of things that need to go into convincing the Swedish people and the other NATO allies that this is a good idea. There aren't really any other countries either that have a large fleet. South Africa is second with 26 active aircraft. Then you have the Czech Republic and Hungary leasing 12 themselves, or 12 each, I suppose. And then you have Thailand with 11. So none of these forces would really be willing to give up a reasonable enough amount of their force to really make them useful in Ukraine, because you can't just send 1 or 2 Gripens and expect them to have a big impact. It's very unfortunate. Now, not only is the procurement of this a pretty big issue, because either Sweden's going to have to part with, say, 10 to 20 of their jets and try to reason with their populace and their military on why that's a good idea, but they also can't really make new ones in a timely manner or really up their production capability to the extent that they could provide Ukraine with 10 to 20 jets within a reasonable time frame. Outside of that, they may be more expensive to actually run in the future. The whole idea with jet procurement, which is kind of the whole idea behind something like the F-35, is the more countries you sell to, the more parts are out in the world and you generate an economy of scale. That's why all of these jets go all over the world or all these companies rather, go all over the world to hawk their jets, to say, hey, listen, this is the price. And that's why you have seen, probably in the last few months, articles saying that the F-35 is almost as cheap, quote unquote, as the Gripen is now, because so many countries have bought into purchasing it, and so many different industrial centers have been reoriented towards making parts or different components for the F-35, that there's an abundance of places where these things are being manufactured, with save the exception of that most of the actual airframes are being developed and built here in the U.S. But not as many with Gripen. There's only a couple of countries in mainland Europe that produce, or use rather, the JAS-39 Gripen. And the 2 that do, the Czech Republic and Hungary, well, they are close to Ukraine, only lease the 12 or 24 in total jets that they have. So they are technically Swedish government property. Now, there's been discussions of letting the Czech Republic and Hungary have those jets, as they effectively have paid for them. But those are still fairly small forces and might make building infrastructure into Ukraine or getting parts into Ukraine a little bit more difficult and pricey in the future, especially with the war continuing. And then we have the combat record, which is something I'm not all that concerned about, to be 100% honest, but it is worth pointing out that the Gripen hasn't seen combat. It's gone through a lot of simulations, it's gone through a lot of exercises, but nowhere in the world has actually used the Gripen in combat, to my knowledge at least. Even the F-35, to an extent, has seen combat with the Israelis, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. However, the Gripen hasn't. So, yeah, that could be a problem. However, the Viggen was a very competent fighter in its own right, as was the Draken, so I'm pretty sure the Gripen, coming from that lineage, is probably going to be pretty competent and much better than what the Ukrainians have at the moment, but you never know. Just something to bring up. Now, when is the right time? Because this is an all-important question I think a lot of people overlook and don't necessarily want to talk about. It is kind of an awkward conversation, and it's a little bit difficult to have. And this is probably the part of the video that if anyone has a problem with, it's going to be this. So, when do you send things? If it's while the war rages, you have a couple of problems. First, it's going to be emergency allocation. Yes, the Swedes are trying to replace the C's and D's in their inventory with E's and F's, but they're not being produced at a fast enough rate to where, Swedish stock would be replaced or replenished anytime soon. That's a bit of a problem. That's a hurdle. However, it is possible, and it could be done, but you would need a lot of political buy-in and some logistical support. Luckily, if you're looking for help from the Czech Republic and Hungary, they're at least located by Ukraine. So at least from a distance perspective, it's not as bad. However, getting parts into Western Ukraine is not the same as getting them into Central or Southern or Eastern Ukraine. Now, I skipped over the Kherson, Kharkiv, and Kerch Bridge thing because I will talk about it in a more exaggerated instance in a moment. But I actually think the successes we've seen here are probably going to hurt the chances of the Ukrainians to get new platforms. Not necessarily new equipment, but new platforms. Having the ability, or at least showing the ability, of having pulled off these very successful, complex military operations, are still ongoing technically, in the Kherson and Kharkiv oblasts, shows the Ukrainians can do these things with the equipment they have. Now, yes, I know the conversation usually turns to, well, if we had or if the Ukrainians had F-16s or Abrams, things would have gone better or faster. Actually, not looking too deep into it because, for being honest, if they had Abrams, the Kharkiv offensive would not have gone as far or deep as it did. Supply lines are much more difficult to maintain with something like Abrams, and when you sack a whole cache of Russian Federation tanks and ammunition and fuel, you can't use it. So luckily for them, they were able to continue that. Now, would they maybe have been more effective in Kherson, where they've seen a little bit more fighting? Maybe. That's possible. It's been a lot slower grind there. However, it's hard to say. But there's the possibility. F-16 kind of the same thing, as they've achieved some local air superiority in some areas, but generally speaking, air superiority is still a very minor aspect of the war just because both sides have pretty substantial integrated air defense systems, and the stuff you have now is probably better than brand new, fresh F-16 pilots we would just now be seeing if the U.S. had allocated and started training at the beginning of the war. So, yes, showing that the Ukrainians can do these types of operations, in the strike on the Kerch Bridge is another one, with the equipment they have and the masses of equipment they garnered in Kherson and Kharkiv, will most likely stop any new aircraft or new tanks from reaching the battlefield anytime soon, especially since the Ukrainians now have a lot of extra tanks. Now, that's just purely speculation, but I think it's pretty reasonable to say that we've passed the point in the war where Ukraine would be swept, right? This is not the 3-day war Putin had wanted. This will probably drag on for another year or two. There's still a lot of territory to gain, but the Ukrainians have made massive strides in the last few months. Now, what if we don't send Gripen in during the war? What if it does end in a couple of years and Ukraine's looking to phase out their Soviet-era jets in favor of something more Western, newer, more capable? Well, then you kind of go for a more standard procurement or export deal, or even a lease like the Czechs and the Hungarians. You have those options, and it kind of allows you to pay it out. In some instances, I believe with the Dassault Rafale, even loans were given that had very low or zero interest rates, from my understanding, to help pay for the procurement, because not only is it good to have your jet exported to another country, it's kind of a good, thing for boosting sales of that jet. It also helps to have an ally with that same capability. Not only can you sell them arms and maintenance and parts and whatnot, but you also have integrated systems that you can use. You can go out and do exercises, and you know that your ally is going to be pretty competent in the air. So you have some options there. All these things would be done roughly in the understanding that even post-war, it's going to take at least a few years for the Ukrainian economy to bounce back to where it was pre-war. Will it grow from there? It's hard to say. It's not exactly an investor's daydream to have a new business in a country that just finished being invaded. Even if you push Russia back out, they have this weird tendency to come back and attack again. They've done it, from my understanding, if I'm remembering correctly, in Georgia and Chechnya. Now, they have suffered way more losses in the Ukrainian invasion than they did in either of those two, so who's to say? But it might still be a little scary for investors. Now, the EU, the US, and several other financial institutions have said they'll help, invest a lot of money into rebuilding Ukraine, so that'll help. But it's still going to be done in the understanding that this is probably a slow procurement process, and it's going to have some long-term financial terms. It's not going to be, hey, here's a big chunk of money. It would allow them to also more organized, in a more organized fashion, phase out their older Soviet craft and reorganize their tactical aviation brigades. Well, a lot of this reorganization can happen during a war. It's usually not best for unit cohesion. So if you can do it outside of a war, that helps, but keep in mind that it does happen in a war. It's just usually better if you can hold out. And then you have the fact that the Ukrainian Air Force is still largely intact. Yes, they've suffered losses, but with parts and spare parts of airframes and things being sent, outside of the Su-24s, they've mostly been able to make up a lot of those losses. So if they still have a competent Air Force that's still flying sorties, I doubt we would see Gripen during the war, but probably post-war, as the Air Force at that time would need to upgrade, as they've already kind of proved themselves in combat. Now, what can the Gripen use? A lot of things. Keep in mind, this is the Gripen E. So there's some things that may not work, but from my understanding, most everything would have a very similar capability. If not, that exact platform could work on the sea. So you have a bunch of short-range IR missiles, you have long-range BVR missiles, you have a lot of air-to-surface missiles and smart bombs, general-purpose bombs. You have some standoff weapons, which is a huge thing we'll talk about in a minute. You have different targeting pods, reconnaissance pods, and then you have the Swedish, but they call it a multi-purpose missile, but it's designed, from my understanding, around an anti-ship missile. So it would pretty much fill every role the Ukrainians would need, and there's a lot of capability there. There's a lot of different sources you could pull from, whether it's the Israelis with the Pythons, some of the European countries with the Iris-T, or the Meteor, or the AMRAAM or AIM-9X from the US, the GPU, the Paveways, all of that stuff can come from the US as well. The Brimstone and Spear from the UK, then like the JSAW and JSAM, JSAM, or the AGM 158, I think it's 156, 158, I think. Both are standoff munitions. They both go a really long ways, and the U.S. has some, so they could possibly be noted in. Now let's take a look at the different tactical aviation brigades and what they might use. Keep in mind that some of this may be specific to the E, but from my understanding, what I was able to find, all of this should still work on the Gripen C or D. So you have a couple of different reconnaissance pods. Well important, isn't necessarily the biggest of deals. A lot of NATO, US, European, in kind of allied information and intelligence is being relayed to the Ukrainians a lot of times in real time. So while reconnaissance is important, you're probably not going to use one of, like, say, the 10 or 20 jets you may get for this purpose, as you already have a lot of that information. Now, you may still use it, but most likely you're probably going to use one of your other craft and kind of go from there. So those reconnaissance pods, well, are probably useful after the fact, or not the biggest deal up front. However, you do have the AGM-154, the AGM-155 for your standoff munitions. These bad boys have a lot of punch to them and go a long way. So the JSAW with a high altitude release has a range of about 70 miles. It can go a pretty long way. Now it is IPS and GPS guided, so inertial navigation and GPS satellite navigation. Both of these are going to be used for strategic hard targets for the most part. Nothing that's moving, nothing tactical, nothing frontline. Your headquarters, air bases, naval bases, railway junctions, headquarters, bigger maintenance depots, arms depots, fuel depots, any of that kind of stuff. You also have the JSAM there. It's about 142 miles, and I've seen different variants say they could go up to like 1,180 miles, but I'm pretty sure some of that is going to have some help from other guidance sources. It is also INS and GPS navigation systems, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't go that far on its own. And there's different variants as well. So kind of keep that in mind, but both of those would give the Ukrainians much longer range than they have now. This is probably the single biggest capability the Ukrainians lack at the moment, which is why they've been really wanting the Atkims for the HIMAR system. It is one large rocket instead of the 6 rocket pod, but it goes much further, so they have a deeper strike capability, and they already have the HIMAR system, so it's just a different type of munition for the most part. It's going to require significantly less training than a Gripen for significantly fewer people. However, it's the question of volume of fire for the HIMAR over single targets. It's a conversation to be had, but regardless, the AGM 154, 158, the JSAW or the JSAM would be capable of pulling these off. You also have the Taurus KEPD, which has a range of about 310 miles from what I was able to see. That's also another capability. I don't think that's as in wide use as the AGMs, so I kind of doubt that would be super donated, but maybe it would be. That's a possibility. It is something the Gripens can carry. And then they have a couple targeting pods, which for standoff munitions like this that are kind of given a specific GPS coordinate aren't really going to be used. But since all of these are multi-role, some of these tactical aviation brigades may be folded into multi-mission type setups, or just maybe having that capability. They could if they needed to. That's why I've got the targeting pods on most of these pages. And then you kind of have the same thing with the 204th. So I forgot to mention, that's the 7th, which is down there in the western quadrant of Ukraine, kind of the southeast part of the western quadrant. And then the 204th is located up north. Now, keep in mind, that is also close to Belarus. So even though these may be based out of these areas, these tactical aviation brigades, with the Gripens operating off of improvised runways, whether it's smaller regional airports or roadways, they're probably not going to be on these airfields, especially with the 204th being so close to Belarus. Now, same thing here, probably going to drop a lot of the recon for at least the short term and focus more on the deep strike or bomber style role. You have a lot of capability there with a pretty deep strike range. So both of these would be pretty instrumental, but if you're only going to get, say, 10 jets, do they go here, or do they go to replacing other things? You have Su-25, MiG-29s, and Su-27s that are still in the air, but the Su-24s, maybe a small handful are still kicking, but they've taken the biggest amount of loss. And from what I've seen, I've only seen like 1 or 2 videos recently of a single one flying by itself. I don't know how many are still active, but these might be the best role initially for the Gripens to take. Then you have the 299th, which is down there in the southern quadrant or the Southern Air Command. This is where your Su-25s and your CAS for your ground attack role are being held. So still have quite a few Su-25s doing these missions, and we've seen a lot of videos of them flying ridiculously low, but generally speaking, the Gripen has a very similar capability. You have the Spear air-to-air or air-to-surface missile, which is GPS and INS guided. It also has the capability of network or laser guidance. So if you have a team on the ground lasing something, or you have different data link capabilities or AWACS in the area, they can help guide that munition closer. It's got a range of about 60 miles, so it's almost kind of a standoff munition. But from my understanding, the warhead's not quite as big, so it wouldn't necessarily do as much damage as the Taurus or the AGMs. You also have the AGM-65 Maverick air-to-surface missile. It's about a 13-mile range. This is something the U.S. has been using for a long time and used a really quite a large amount, from my understanding, in Desert Storm and both the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. You also have the Brimstone, which is another UK thing, much like the Spear, a range of anywhere from 12 to 24 miles. So you're more close-in air-to-ground stuff. These are more guided munitions, so this would allow the Gripens to be further away than the Su-25s have been. But that's something that is also probable if, the Ukrainians were to get Gripens. The UK has been pretty good about sending things, so they'd probably send stuff like that. You also have the GBU-39 and the GBU-53. Anywhere from like a 69-mile radius for a static target or 28 to 45 miles against a moving target. You also have the JDAM, about 17 miles. You have the Paveway series, which is a whole different set of series of bombs with different ranges and capabilities. But the U.S. has a bunch of those as well, so that's something that very, very easily would probably be donated. So that's a pretty big capability. It's a big win for the Gripen in that department. You have your Mark 80 general purpose bomb. That's just kind of your regular dumb bomb. The Spice 1000 smart bomb's got a range of estimated about 62 miles. This one I'm not as familiar with, so I'm not 100% sure how exactly that works. But it is something that has been listed as being used by the Gripen, so it's possible. And those targeting pods would come in much more handy on this loadout than pretty much any of the other ones. But this can be a pretty big bomb truck, as you see there. It can carry quite a payload. And if you're trying to get on some STOF or static targets, or even moving armor, a lot of these munitions will, at the very least, probably disable it, if not destroy it in some instances. Then you have the 114th. The 114th is based out there in the Western Air Command, southwestern, kind of in the more mountainous region of Ukraine. This has kind of the full air-to-air loadout with the addition of the HARM. So you've got the Iris-T air-to-air missile. This has a range of about 16 miles. You've got the Darter, which is about 12. The Python 4 and 5, which is about 12. The AIM-9X, which is about 22 miles. Then you get into the heavy hitters, the BVR, the stuff that the Ukrainians don't have a direct competitor for. All of the ones I just listed are more advanced technologically speaking, but they have short to medium range missiles. They don't have a lot of BVR capability, though, beyond visual range. Anything that's going to reach out and touch something, 20, 25, 30 miles plus out of the way. And at this point, BVR might as well be much further than those numbers, but generally speaking, I think that's the consensus for the start of BVR. So you have the Meteor, which is a very big deal in Europe right now. That has a range of about 124 miles. Now, keep in mind, earlier I said that pulse Doppler radar only had a range of about 70 miles. So without any AWACS support or any other data link stuff, that is going to kind of shrink the range of some of these a little bit, as you're not going to be able to pick up those things on radar to see them to fire the missile at that range. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, that's not to say that, AWACS flying above Poland or UAVs or anything flying above the Black Sea could help, but it's hard to say. Some of those ranges can get a little finicky. Anyway, you also have the AMRAAM-C, which has a range of about 65 miles, and the AMRAAM-D, which has a range of about 99 miles. That's kind of the new hotness right now for the U.S., outside of the AMRAAM, I think, 260 that's currently in development. Then you have the Derby air-to-air missile, which has a range of about 31 miles. This is the kind of big brother to the Python, if you will. You also have that anti-ship missile I was talking about, and the Ukrainians use the Neptune missiles, which is, I believe, a variation of the HARM, and that might be able to be fixed to a plane, but they've had a pretty good amount of luck firing them from the shore, so I don't really think that this would be super necessary, especially if you only have 10, 15, 20 of these, but it is something that would be possible. You also have the capability probably of using the AGM-88 HARM. But a lot of more modern aircraft have kind of gotten away from anti-radiation missiles as they're large, they're expensive, and generally speaking, not super effective. One of the things that hurts the harm for the most part is they're big and expensive, sure, but they're also something you have to fire in volume in a time on target attack. So if you're firing like 16 of these, which is a kind of reasonable number, that's a lot of money. That's several million. That may be over $10 million, depending on which variant of the harm you're using. For one attack to destroy, which is still, a pretty good trade-off, a network, a SAM system, but, a SAM system is not one vehicle. It's anywhere from 5 to 15, depending on which site, and maybe bigger. One missile, two missiles, three missiles, really not going to do a lot. And while the Ukrainians have had some success, those individual harm missiles have not destroyed the entire site. They've either damaged a radar unit or destroyed one of the actual launcher systems. Harms, still something we can send, still something they can use, and something the U.S. kind of maybe moving away from towards more networked capability. If you've got an AWACS being able to see some of these things from a longer range, you can say, hey, just drop, some standoff munitions or bombs or something. We can help kind of guide them in to where you don't have to get as close and you have better luck firing more cheaper munitions to disrupt that site. So that is kind of a whole thing in and of itself. And then you, of course, have the targeting pods if you want to carry a couple of ground munitions or something. But it is something that is possibly capable. I haven't seen any confirmed reports that the Gripen would carry the harm, but there's also not a lot of reason to suspect it would. But if we're affixing it to MiG-29s and Su-27s, we could probably affix it to a Gripen. Then you have the 204th, which is the same 204th. Yes, I know it's confusing. Down there in the Southern Air Command. The 204th was originally based in Crimea and then got split when they had to move into Ukraine proper. So this is the kind of southern air defense, if you will. All the same ranges, all the same missile capabilities. More likely than not, if I had to hazard a guess, you would probably see these, if they're going to be dedicated to a tactical aviation brigade and operate around it, not necessarily off of the air base it's based in, it would probably be this one. Possibly the next one we'll talk about is you can get some range to go into western or eastern Ukraine, but generally speaking, you're a lot closer to a lot more of the front line if you're down there with the 204th than you are in any of these other bases. So all the same air-to-air capability, and if you wanted to go multi-mission or return, do that 10-minute turnaround and load up with ground munitions or deep strike, you can do that. Then you have the 40th, which is up there around Kyiv in the Central Air Command. Something you could absolutely do, and if you're just going to tie these planes to a specific tactical aviation brigade but not have them operate anywhere near it, then your guess is as good as mine. But generally speaking, you generally want your planes operating in the same theater of command that you're based in. So most likely the 204th if you're going to replace the MiG-29s, but the MiG-29s have still been flying a fair few sorties, so once again, kind of going back to the Su-24s got decimated, so they might be needing a little bit of help there in that role. And then you have the air superiority groups. The 39th Tactical Aviation Brigade is based on the western side of the Central Air Command. All of the same capabilities here. This would replace the Su-27. They would have more BVR capability. So much like the MiG-29, air interdiction, kind of air superiority to an extent, your mid to short range missiles are probably going to be your more prevalent weapon. The Su-27, you're going to rely much more heavily on BVR capability. So if the Gripens went to this, they would replace those Su-27s in their higher altitude combat air patrols, air superiority missions, maybe some interception roles to an extent. However, you have to remember a lot of the strategic bombers that the Ukrainian or the Russians have been using to fire some of these air-launched cruise missiles are firing them within the Russian border. And those deep strike missiles or those cruise missiles have much more range than your air-to-air missiles will. So, kind of take that as you will. But if something from Belarus or the Russian border flies in, and it meets a Meteor or an AMRAAM, it's going to be at least at parity to whatever the Russian air superiority fighter coming in is, or in some instances, maybe a little bit better. So there is an argument to be made that maybe the Gripens would be best served in this role. But once again, I still think if you're replacing a capability, you might as well replace the Su-24s at this point, because most of them are gone. Then you have the 831st. I just realized I put the TH instead of the ST. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Don't look at it. Anyway, so this one is based on the eastern side of the Central Air Command, much closer to a lot more of the Donbass front lines. And these, combat air patrol, air superiority, but once again, the Russians are still only flying a few hundred missions a day, which, sounds like a lot, but by comparison, the coalition forces in Desert Storm were flying 1,500 a day against Iraq. So, reasonably speaking, for an air force the size of Russia's, that's not a lot of missions. And a lot of them being strategic bomber missions that are firing cruise missiles from within the Russian border. So, you kind of keep that in mind, that this is something the Su-27s are still capable of, and there's a good possibility that, if they wanted to keep that airframe going, they absolutely could, and maybe fix more modern munitions to it if it really became an issue. So let's talk about logistics, because this is an important thing that I think a lot of people just never get to, because it's just easy to say, so send F-16s. Poland had just some F-16s. They've used F-16s. Romania's used F-16s. Slovakia, I think, has also used F-16s, or is getting F-16s. But it's not necessarily as easily said as it is done. And extending a lot of these supply lines aren't necessarily easy either. So, as I said, the Swedes have 74 Cs, 24 Ds, and just two E's in service, if I'm correct. If they may have more at this point, but not by a whole lot. And the Brazilians have between 3 and 5, I think. So, sure, maybe take out some C's, kind of retire them early, send them to Ukraine as you wait for more E's. Still not necessarily easily done, but sure, Sweden's not that much further up this map. You could definitely transport them through Poland or something like that. But in terms of getting parts and the infrastructure you would need to support these aircraft, well, they're still simple. They're still very complex machines. You have some maintenance capability and some parts capability there in the Czech Republic and Hungary. Hungary directly borders Ukraine and the southwest there. So they could definitely use some major highways to get in that way. I believe there's also some rail lines through there. Or, they could fly in through an airport or fly in things and then truck them over the border like they've been doing in Poland. Or you could go from the Czech Republic or Chechnya and use some of the highways that go through Poland down into Lviv, and then down kind of into more of the other more combat-heavy areas. But generally speaking, just because you have a factory producing certain components or replacement parts in Hungary or the Czech Republic, you're not going to have them necessarily easily gotten past the border. You may need quite a few of them, but then what if the country of origin needs them, right? And especially with the possibility that maybe Russia decides just to go mad dog and starts invading other people, they kind of want to have their air force. And well, yeah, the other European nations can kind of help out, which is I think what has happened with Slovakia. That doesn't necessarily ease the minds of the populace in those countries. So extending and expanding those manufacturing capabilities isn't something that happens overnight. and wouldn't be a short process. And, maybe if it's quick, a few months. But with these two countries only leasing these units, a lot of parts and maintenance, from my understanding, is still coming from Saab and Sweden. So there's not even like a huge industrial base there already. Sure, you can definitely fly or boat things over from Sweden into Poland, but you have to go the entire stretch of Poland. And the Poles don't use the Gripen, so there's not a lot of reason for them to build factories for Gripen parts. Now, does that necessarily mean that that wouldn't be a thing that would happen? Maybe. More economic benefits for Poland never hurt. But generally speaking, if they're not going to be able to use them, and Ukraine only needs a small handful of them for a short period, they might not be as interested. Putting on top of that, you have several different open orders. The Swedes and Brazilians both have orders open for ease right now, but they also have existing parts and maintenance agreements with the Czech Republic, Hungary, Thailand, and South Africa. So parts and weapons may also be a bit of a concern. Now, at least weapons, AMRAAM, AGM stuff can definitely come from the U.S., and we've got stockpiles to an extent. But generally speaking, the logistical challenges of something like this, which is probably one of the simpler options, even by comparison to the F-16, there's, I wouldn't say fewer moving parts, but fewer things to kind of go wrong in the chain of things. It is still a very complicated thing. We aren't, Sweden's not going to send 10 Gripens to Ukraine tomorrow and wish them luck. They're, of course, going to need to train pilots and maintenance crews, and even if that only takes a few months, being sure that you're able to not only send these airframes with these trained crews and personnel, but also supply them the equipment and parts that are going to need to maintain them is a whole nother ballgame. So, a bit of a problem, not impossible, and it's a little bit better than something else we'll look at a little, in another video. But it is something that should be noted, and it's kind of a hurdle for something like Gripen. Then you have the politics. Politics is always fun. And this is where I get to talk about that whole Ukrainian double-edged sword success situation, but not before I talk about European politics and NATO politics. So first, Saab and Sweden would need to convince their populace, their government, and their air force that sending a reasonable number of Gripens to Ukraine is a good idea. From all of those standpoints, military, civilian, and government, that is a security risk. That is less capability that the Swedish Air Force is going to be able to bring to bear in case something happens. And, the Swedes and the Finns are going through the process still technically of being incepted into NATO. They're going to have to hold out for a little bit of time, right? So they do need capability, and there is a significant security concern. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, there's a bigger security concern in Ukraine as they're still actively being invaded. Yes, you're technically right, but Sweden is not the U.S. They do not have the same capability to send, 10, 15, 20 fighters and really not have any issues. Geographically, they're much closer to the conflict region. They have a smaller air force, and while it operates in a very unique way, the fewer aircraft you're capable of fielding, the less combat capability you're going to have. So, all things equal, say the Swedes do it. Say the populace, the military, and the government are all on board, send Gripens to Sweden. Then you have to convince the rest of NATO. Well, it's not necessarily a hard, fast rule. You don't want to sow division in amongst other NATO countries. And the problematic ones are going to be France, Sweden, and Turkey. I believe Bulgaria is also another one, if I'm remembering correctly. But generally speaking, these are the ones that wield the most influence and power and would be able to kill an idea like this much faster. France has been okay with sending some things, artillery pieces, financial aid, things of that nature. But they've also, with Macron, been kind of a little bit more peace talk acceptable, I suppose. Now, I think at this point, Macron's kind of given up on the idea of calling Putin to work this out, but generally speaking, that's their orientation. They want to focus a little bit more on bringing peace, especially, while Macron just won his re-election not long ago. If he can get that done, even if he doesn't do a lot, but if it happens in his reign, he can absolutely claim some kind of victory in it. And that will be something he can use for re-election or political status or anything of that nature. And it's kind of been I don't want to say fence sitting, but they're trying to walk a very fine line. That's more of a political situation. The German one is slightly different. The German one is political, but it's also partially a logistics and actual physical items on hand problem. And part of it's also a law thing. So, technically speaking, any of these countries, like say Saab wanted to send Gripens, but the Swedish government was like, no, those Gripens are not leaving the country. That's kind of the same thing that's happened with Germany and Rheinmetall in trying to send different pieces of equipment. The German government's been like, no. Part of it is a security concern as well, especially when it comes to tanks like the Leopard 1s, I think. They're not necessarily frontline tanks, but the state of the German military is not ideal. Their procurement process is very strange. Their budgetary process is also very strange from a military procurement standpoint. Perun does a phenomenal video on this if you're curious. It's just like if you want to sit there and listen to someone for almost an hour talk about the weird intricacies of German procurement and budgetary policy, that's a video you're going to love. But there's also a lot of different political parties that have a lot of differing views on what should be done. Some people really just want to sue for peace initially, like right now. Just it doesn't matter what the Ukrainians want, go for peace right now, even if it's disadvantageous to the Ukrainians. Others are much, much, much more hawkish. And you have Olaf Scholz and his government kind of in the middle of that. Part of the reason they haven't been able to send things is not having really a coalition. Some of it's not having the items or the parts or the munitions. And other parts of it is just, we don't want to undercut our own program. The Germans do have a program in place for any country that sends like tanks or heavy equipment to Ukraine, that the Germans will compensate them with their own equipment, which typically is better. However, it's not a one-to-one deal, and some countries have been a little bit salty about it. Poland is one of them in particular. And then you have Turkey, which still has open relations with Russia. So there's a weird diplomatic situation there that, well, the Turks have come out and said, hey, Russia needs to leave Ukraine and Crimea is Ukraine. They've also still been doing business and openly talking and trying to hold peace talks and conferences and stuff. And to some success, they were able to broker that deal that the Ukrainians were able to export grain. Now, of course, the Russians have still continued to fire on Odessa, but generally speaking, ships are getting out and you've seen an increase in grain export. Is it a huge increase? Comparatively speaking, yes, but it's not anywhere near what the Ukrainians were doing before the war, as you'd expect, since a lot of their fertile land is still under occupation or has been devastated by the war. So the Turks are an interesting one to get on board. They also kind of have some tensions with the Swedes, so kind of you take that as you will. The Swedes kind of had to give some concessions in order to secure Turkey's approval for NATO. Then you have the Ukrainian capability question. The Ukrainians have been able to do these massive counteroffensives. If you see there in Kharkiv, that's a lot of territory. That is like the entirety of the Kharkiv Oblast, if I'm correct, is now in Ukrainian hands. You have them pushing in towards Luhansk and, going through these different vital railway hubs. that are huge for Russian supply lines. So the general consensus is they're going to try to push this back towards, shrinking the Eastern Front, being much more concentrated, going back to kind of the Donbass. And then you've got the side over there in Kherson, which has been, even more so since this, because this was October 6th, this was a few days ago, have made pretty large gains towards Kherson. That is something they've done with their capabilities, the things they have now. So the question is, how effective is this force going to be being newly trained on something like Abrams or Challenger 2 or Leopard? Would they be as successful with those platforms and being more green on them than they are with the equipment they have and they're used to? Especially considering that the Kharkiv offensive has captured a significant amount of extra pretty much everything, especially when it comes to armored vehicles, tanks in particular. So, is there really a reason when the Ukrainian Air Force is still effectively as capable as it would be with the integrated air defense systems still active to sending Gripen? Would it really provide them a drastically different capability that they're lacking right now? That is a question that can absolutely be talked about. I think that there are going to be a lot of people, personally, that will use this as saying, hey, maybe we'll just wait for the end of the war and secure maybe a deal to bring the Ukrainians up to a NATO standard, at the very least, if not, try to incept them into NATO, which is a whole nother thing that I'm not going to talk about in this video. But at least bring them up to that standard and get them trained up on one of those other platforms. Now, it depends on who takes the lead in that, is what platform it is, but most of the European platforms would probably be a little easier than Abrams. Abrams is a little bit more complicated, a little finickier, especially when it comes to supply lines. But generally speaking, the success in Kharkiv would not have been possible had the Ukrainians been rocking Challengers, Leopards, or any other modern tank. The ability to use the stockpiles of weapons they had just freshly captured to continue their offensive was a big reason they were able to recover that much ground so quickly and keep the Russians off balance. Now, there's still active fighting in both of these regions. There's probably more gains to be made, but keep in mind, the better these go for the Ukrainians and the more stuff they capture, the less likely you are to see tanks and the less likely you are to see new platforms like aircraft. Probably. That's just my random dude on the internet's opinion. I'm not a professional, I'm not a politician, I'm not an analyst, and I do not work in the defense industry. But that brings us to our special thanks. You have Logan Hartke, who designed one of the Ukrainian Gripen designs. You also have Andres Lestchik. Sorry, I know I butchered both of those names. They did both of the Ukrainian Gripen designs, so let's go back here so I can show those off real quick. So this one is Logan's. This is Andres. And then this one is the other. Let's get back down here. That's militaryleak.com, the Gripen armament graphic. There's a couple of different varieties of this floating around that you can find on Google. So, just kind of look around. You'll definitely find them. Emil Lindberg did this photo right here with the reconnaissance pod. So thank you, Emil, for that. And then you have some people that I've pulled information from or that have kind of educated me on how some of this stuff works, just through their videos, not like personal interactions or anything. But Ward Carroll has a very interesting YouTube channel from an aviation standpoint. Military Aviation History is also another great YouTube channel for stuff like this. Annie Marchi History is another great channel for this that's been regularly keeping up with the Ukraine stuff. And of course, Perun. If you're not watching Perun videos and you like long-form slideshows, that is the channel that inspired this. So you will definitely like their much more intricate, much more educated information. Very informational. And as I said earlier in the video, there's a lot of very interesting videos they've done. So be sure to check them out. And what am I going to talk about in the future? Well, I've almost got the Ukrainian Hornet slideshow done, just kind of punching up part of the script now. Some of this is scripted, some of it's not, just depends on kind of what the slide is and what information is needed there. I've also got the Ukrainian's next MBT, main battle tank, in the works. It's getting there. It's not quite done, but it is getting close. And then the future of Ukraine's Navy is very early. So don't expect that, in the next few weeks. But generally speaking, the Hornet one is almost done, and the main battle tank's not going to be too far behind that. And it'll be much closer to part 2 of this video, where I just look at all of the main battle tanks and see what works. So let me know in the comments down below if there's anything else you would like me to try to look at in the future. These are at least my kind of next few projects, but I definitely wouldn't mind looking into other things if it's something that interests me. Anyway, thanks for watching, y'all. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.